Hello and welcome back to the 3 on NY-3 podcast. My name is Andrew Whitman. I'm an unemployed political journalist who lives inside the boundaries of the 3rd District, which is one of the reasons that I got involved. The other is to try to give better information to voters and give better access to candidates for voters in this new 5-county, very disparate 3rd District. Today's episode is going to be our focus and analysis on Nassau County, its politics, its voters, and a little bit of a tour to the county itself. For that, we'll be turning to former Democratic Nassau County Executive Laura Curran. She will join us in just a few moments. But I want to begin this episode with some updates on the podcast itself. And the most important update is that we have now had commitments from every Democrat in the field that they are going to appear on the program. We have all but 2 of the Democrats now fully scheduled in the upcoming days and weeks, and we hope to clarify that scheduling to make sure that all 6 Democrats are represented coming up very shortly. The identity of the primary candidates has had a lot to do with the direction that this podcast will take and has taken so far. And we got a big step closer to getting some clarity on the race and the candidates last Thursday, April 7th. That was the filing deadline for candidate petitions and the primary focus on getting voter signatures from voters in the district. Candidates have to submit 1,250 signatures of district residents to make the primary ballot. And the key word there is the word valid. They have to be valid signatures. There are always lots of challenges to the signature process. It's become a staple of politics in New York, every bit as much as the get out to vote process or drafting bumper stickers or lawn signs. So expect some challenges to come through. We will find out if the field will remain at 6 or if it grows larger or grows smaller. We should also get some additional clarity on the status of the ballot, who the leading candidates may be after April 15th. That's the next Federal Elections Commission filing deadline. We'll get a sense of which candidates are raising money, and how much they've raised is usually an indication of that campaign's strength or weakness. Now, we did learn a little bit from the filings that make it less likely that Tom Suozzi, who now represents the 3rd District and lives inside the boundaries of the new NY-3, that he might somehow reverse his thinking and run for re-election, though frankly, not anybody outside of my brain has been talking about that much out loud. Suozzi, as you may know, is running for governor, and we have certainly seen other candidates seek statewide office. And then when that fails for one reason or another, they return and run for and have actually won re-election to Congress after their plans failed. I was keeping an eye on Suozzi for that possibility. Now seems less likely. Why? Suozzi's gubernatorial campaign was strengthened last week when former Governor Andrew Cuomo did not submit a petition or signatures to enter the Democratic primary in a potential run for governor. So Cuomo's absence from the gubernatorial race, and especially the primary, makes it that much more likely that Suozzi will remain in the gubernatorial race as he mounts his challenge to current incumbent Governor Kathy Hochul, as well as New York City public advocate Jumaane Williams in the Democratic primary. And in fact, this week, I happened to see my first Suozzi for governor ad while watching the Mets game. Good start to the Mets season, and we'll see what kind of start it is to the Suozzi gubernatorial campaign. This podcast, though, is only going to focus for now on the Democratic candidates for Congress, because based on earlier state filings, there's only one Republican who is running. His name is George Santos, and he is running on both the Republican and conservative lines. He's not facing a competitive primary, so we're not going to focus on that for this portion of the podcast. There's also a candidate running on the Working Families Party line, Josh Goldfein, though that status could change after the Democratic primary. We've seen plenty of examples in the past where the Working Families Party puts a Democrat or the Democratic nominee on their line to try to attract more votes, which helps them overall the health of the party and ballot access. So we'll see what happens with the Working Families Party. And we'll return to those candidates, the candidates who will appear in the general election ballot. We'll get back to them, at least on this podcast, after the June 28th Democratic primary. But for now, we're going to continue to learn more about the district and its voters. And today we focus on the largest chunk of the new NY-3, Nassau County. And for that, we enlisted the help of somebody who knows the county and the political mood of Nassau residents particularly well, Laura Curran. Ms. Curran was the Nassau County executive from 2018 to 2021. She was only the third Democrat ever elected to that position. Before that, she had served in the county legislature. Now, Curran last faced voters in Nassau County last year in the 2021 elections, losing a close re-election bid. And her experiences in that election resulted in some advice that she's going to offer to this year's congressional candidates, especially when it comes to one particular issue. We spoke on April 7th. Just hours after that interview came word of a deal on a new state budget in Albany, which actually also had an update on the issue that Curran singled out. We'll get to that after the Curran interview. But for now, without further ado, my interview with former Nassau County Executive Democrat Laura Curran. Former Nassau County Executive Laura Curran, welcome to the 3 on NY-3 podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
You have been a private citizen, Laura Curran, these past 4 months for the first time in 8 years, having been Nassau County Executive and then before in the Nassau County Legislature. What have you been up to these past 4 months? Have you had any reentry issues?
Well, I have to tell you, life as a normal person is not so bad. It's been great, spending time with my family, with my kids. 2 of my younger kids are still home. And I've just joined the Mount Sinai South Nassau Board of Directors. So that's really interesting. Those are my communities down there on the South Shore. So things are good. Nothing to complain about. Thank you for asking.
It's my pleasure. Do you still have flashback moments? Do you at 8:30 in the morning, are you like, boy, if I was still in my old job, I've had 3 meetings already by now, or anything like that?
Absolutely. And it's funny now, when I like a busy day is nothing like a busy day as county executive. That's right. You've had 3 meetings by breakfast. There's a snowstorm coming. There's something going on in the accounting department. There's a crime, there's always many plates in the air that you've got to keep track of spinning. And it's kind of nice to kind of take a breather when there's a snowstorm that's coming. It's not my problem. I can just enjoy it.
Right. Do you wind up getting still complaints from constituents and from Nassau County residents?
Not so much at the beginning, yes, but those have petered out. But people still ask for my advice and who they should talk to and that sort of thing. And I'm always happy to help.
All right, so let's move into our analysis of the new 3rd district in New York. Before we do that, I want to ask if you're endorsing or supporting any candidates in the race.
Yes, so I have endorsed Robert Zimmerman. He's been a friend for many years. He was loyal to me, supported my candidacies. But I say that knowing that others in the race, and there are many in the race, have their base of support. They have, their rationale for running. And I honestly think any of them could do a good job were they elected.
Appreciate the disclosure on that. And certainly our viewers and our listeners will be able to take that and keep that in mind as they listen to your analysis in the 3rd. And also, as it turns out, last Thursday, we dropped the 3 on NY-3 interview with Robert Zimmerman. So viewers and listeners can take a listen or take a look at that. And make those decisions for themselves. So let's get into the 3rd district itself. And as we look at the current 3rd district, it seems as though the change in the district has been, at least in Nassau County, to shrink the district from north to south, whereas earlier it occupied about 2/3 of the width of Nassau County going from north to south. It seems like that has been shrunk, and the bottom terminus of the district is now further north than it was. Maybe it's now the top half of Nassau County. Is that about right from your take on the new district?
Yes, because they're adding a small part of the Bronx and Westchester. They've thinned out the Nassau part of it. But the interesting thing is 5 of the candidates, if my counting is correct, 5 of them, believe there are 6 or 7 candidates, live in Nassau County. So I think this is still perceived as a very Nassau-centric district. And Nassau is literally in the center of the district. It's right in the heart of it.
Yeah, and it's made sense, at least as I've been looking at the district, to sort of view it as in the footprint of the old 3rd district, which elected Tom Suozzi. It's just a little bit truncated and then expanded on the sides, stretching east into Suffolk and west into the city and up to Westchester County. The goal of state lawmakers when they created this district was to create more Democratic districts, more safe Democratic districts, at least in theory. So has it worked in your judgment? Is that portion of the old district that they took out, they moved into the first district? I assume those were a fairly Democratic or Democratic leaning portion of Nassau County.
Which part is this exactly are you referring to?
The part the central part of Nassau that's been removed from the third and moved into the first.
So you mean more Republican?
I'm not sure. I'm asking you.
Central Nassau County tends to be more Republican.
Okay. If based on all other factors aside, theoretically speaking, should that plan by state lawmakers work? Should that make the first, the third, the fourth more Democratic and making as much of the second as Republican as possible?
Yeah, that seems to be what they're doing here. You know, as we see, whoever's in power gets to draw the lines. And since the crew before tries to make it more Republican, the next crew tries to make it more Democratic. That's just what happens. It's unfortunate. I think gerrymandering along party lines is not good for democracy. I don't think it really makes for competitive races between Republicans and Democrats. The competition is really more competitive in the primary. And honestly, I don't really think that serves people well. That's just my personal opinion about gerrymandering in general, but it's the way it is. And, you know, people will react if they're in power. They want to keep power, so they'll do everything they can to keep it. And honestly, Democrats and Republicans both do it when they can. Because if they can't hold on to power, the next crew is going to do the same exact thing.
So theoretically, the maneuvering, the machinations by the Democratic-led state legislature should help Democrats in a number of the districts on Long Island. As for the practical application of all that, that brings us to the 2022 elections. And it seems like there are bad winds blowing for Democrats. President Biden's numbers aren't great. History of the party in power in midterms is not good. Most Democrats, frankly, aren't focused on politics, probably won't be until the last week of May and the beginning of June when the Supreme Court comes in. You've faced this electorate last year in your bid for re-election as Nassau executive. You did cite one major issue as being a factor in the outcome of that election, and that was bail reforms in New York State. If I can summarize, and let me know if I get this right, you were on the ballot. You were at the top of the ballot last year. You shared the ballot with Todd Kaminsky, a state senator who wrote the bail reform law. He was running for Nassau County District Attorney. So you were on the ballot with him. You both lost. I don't want to debate bail reform on its merits here, but let's use it as an example. There are political lessons and cautions that bail reform specifically you think poses for Democrats in the third. And I'm sure that there are other potential hot button issues as well.
Yeah, bail reform politically is very challenging in a place like Nassau County, which is moderate. You tend to have moderate Republicans and you tend to have moderate Democrats. Most people are somewhere in that moderate spectrum. Yes, you'll have some people on the fringes on the right and the left, but they're the exception. Bail reform did prove in my election, as you just talked about, a very tricky issue. And while I had come out against it pretty publicly, I was not inoculated because I'm a Democrat, and it's seen as a Democratic Party weakness among many people. And a Siena poll that came out said 56% of all people, all New Yorkers, think it's not good for public safety. Even Democrats, it was 46 to 38% think it's not good for New York State. So that tells you something. However, the thing that makes it politically interesting is that the further left you go, the more support bail reform gets. In a primary, in a Democratic primary, people will go towards, the candidates will go more towards the left because that's where the votes are. There will not be a lot of people voting. The more activist kind of people will probably be more interested in voting. So it's always interesting to see how candidates toe that line. Do they go all in? Like Tom Suozzi, who is leaving the seat now to run for governor, he said, this is too much. We got to change bail reform. He doesn't pull any punches there. But will others tread more carefully? Will the candidates say, well, maybe this, maybe that, maybe we could tweak it, maybe we should do that? How do they play it? Because in the general, it will be used against the Democrats. Even if whoever Democrat wins is against it, it will still be used against them. That's the interesting thing to watch here vis-a-vis bail reform.
I have a few questions about that. we've seen a number of political cycles over the years where there's always a wedge issue that seems to be popped up. I can remember Willie Horton being a law and order issue in the Bush-Dukakis election in
Yes,
1988.
right.
We've certainly seen hot button issues over the years that have popped up. Couldn't it have been any issue really? Was there something specific about bail reform, or wouldn't Republicans have found something else to substitute for bail reform that they think could have punctured a Democratic candidate?
Perhaps it's taxes and crime. Taxes and crime. Those are issues that the Republicans are good at honing in on. And whether it's 100% truthful or not, they're good at exploiting those issues because they get people angry and they get them afraid. And Democrats do the same sort of thing. I'm not saying it's just a Republican thing. But there is something about bail reform that does hit a nerve. We are seeing crime going up across the country. We've been seeing what's happening in New York City with the crime. If you watch the news and you read the paper, you see terrible things happening to our neighbor to the west. So it is an issue that really hits close to home. And a lot of Democrats, I speak to a lot of Democrats, I speak to a lot of Republicans. A lot of Democrats are concerned about crime. They're concerned about what it means, if they live in the city. They're concerned about their kids. They're concerned about what it means for property values. People want to feel safe. It's just a basic human instinct. So there's something when you make people feel less safe and you say this person is doing that to you, that's a very persuasive tactic.
The numbers that you gave in the polling that you cited, they're certainly tipping in opposition to the bail reform law, but it didn't strike me as being overwhelming numbers. They're certainly
there's one
leaning
number that
it.
I didn't give you. So 64% of all New Yorkers say that bail reform has resulted in increased crime. That's a lot. That's 2/3.
That's also a statewide number. I'm just wondering, is there a way of explanation? If the issue is better explained or challenged, that perhaps outlets like the New York Post are blowing it out of proportion, or the numbers don't necessarily back it up, or here are some examples of where the law has benefited people. Do you think there's enough room on the issue that it can be explained so that it's less of a detriment to Democratic candidates?
Knowing how things go in a general campaign when they heat up, I think the answer is no. Okay. Anything it can be exploited and twisted and presented in such a way to freak people out. It's just the way it is. And I saw it happen.
All right. So with that, let's look now, if we can, at some of the particulars of the district itself. And it's a wide, it stretches across the width of Nassau County. And it's all hugging the North Shore, or primarily hugging the North Shore. From the map, the city of Glen Cove pops out as being in bold type, as does Oyster Bay on the map. I love the designation of places and towns in New York State. The city of Glen Cove has 27,000 people. The town of Oyster Bay has 300,000 people living in it, though not all of Oyster Bay is in the third. In fact, it's broken up, I think, into all 4 districts. What can you tell us about the district? This portion of the district itself, is population spread evenly across northern Nassau? What parts of the district what parts of the district seem to have the most political activity in it? Are there any Democratic hubs or Republican hubs in that area? What can you tell us?
Well, the city of Glen Cove is pretty active. That's where Tom Suozzi is from. That's where he lives. That's where his family is from. However, it just was won by the Republicans. So that's something to keep note of. Port Washington is really emerging as a progressive area. There's a pretty active progressive group there. In fact, one of the candidates comes right from that community. So that's something to watch. North Hempstead, which is the other town, which isn't to the west of Glen Cove, that has actually also been won by a Republican supervisor. So Glen Cove, North Hempstead, those have been pretty good, dependable Democratic areas that have just gone Republican. So it'll be interesting to see how this works for this race. Now, The turnout in 2021 was abysmally low. In Nassau County, this is in my election, about 25% of Democrats turned out, and this is in the general election, and close to 40% of Republicans turned out. There will probably be more Democratic turnout in this race because you've got the governor's race, you got her primary, you've got the congressional, the midterms. Democrats will probably feel there's more skin in the game for them on this race than they did for the local races, the more local races. So that could help turnout. With this district, with Nassau County generally, it's all about turnout. Can you get your voters to turn up at the polls? And I'll be very interested to see with this primary with so many people in it, how many people come out and where they go. We also, I think the petitioning should be done today, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe tomorrow. So let's see who actually gets all their petitions done. Let's see if they can withstand any challenges. I mean, we could have a smaller field at the end of this. We just don't know.
And we're recording this on Thursday, April 7th. And so we'll get some more information on those petition and the petition process in the days to come. The bulk of the district's population is in the Nassau County portion of the district, but there are going to be some voters in Suffolk, Westchester, Queens, and the Bronx who maybe aren't that familiar. And this podcast goes around the world. If anybody is tuning in from anywhere who really doesn't know the area at all, welcome if you're with us. Give us, if you will, the quote unquote real estate guide to Northern Westchester, if you can. How similar are the communities along the North Shore? Are they classically suburban communities? Are there some urban centers in there? Do the communities have their own little downtown areas? Is it, commuters by train, or how heavy do people focus on the highways, that sort of thing?
Yes to all of the above. Northern Nassau County, there's a lot of variety. There is growing diversity. The biggest growing community is the Asian community, Chinese community, the Hindu community, the Muslim community. They're all growing by leaps and bounds. And they're finding their feet. This is a community that is really finding its feet politically now. And if I were advising any one of these candidates, I would say make inroads in the Asian community, because those are a lot of voters. They're becoming very active. They have a vested interest, like everybody, like all of us, in the success of our schools, in the success of our communities, in public safety. So that's something interesting to watch. But you'll see great diversity. I mean, just take the city of Glen Cove alone. You've got folks of all different ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds. You have very rich people. You have folks who are, working families. You've got it all. There are definite pockets of wealth in that northern strip, however, in Woodbury and all, those kinds of places, in closer to east, in the eastern side of the North Shore, quite wealthy, big properties, very concerned about property taxes. The SALT deduction issue will be a huge issue for those voters.
Just to clarify for people, that's the state and local tax deduction that used to be deductible on federal taxes and is no longer as a result of the Trump tax cuts that were enacted.
That's right. And Tom Suozzi has made a lot of good progress there. He made a really big deal about this. He got a win out of it. And but there's more to be done. So I'm sure the candidates are all, in fact, I've seen them, they're all talking about this as a priority for them.
Tell me about those growing Asian communities that you were mentioning. Have they established a political orientation in general? Are they Democratic voters? Are they Republican voters? Or do we not yet really know whether there's going to be a focus for those voters?
It's unclear at this point. We just don't know. They tend, this is just speaking very, very broadly, but
Sure.
tend to be conservative and have family values. But they're also, appeal. I certainly got a lot of support from the Asian community as a Democrat as well. But this is a community that should not be ignored, as no community should be ignored.
Play tourism board / chamber of commerce for me very briefly. Can you think of 3 sites or 3 places that I must go in the northern part of Nassau County if I've never been there before?
Oh, yes. There's this adorable little village called Bayville, which is sort of like a working man's Hamptons. That's what it was back in the day. Beautiful little houses, gorgeous little seaside, very charming restaurants, really lovely place. You might, while you're there, want to go over the bridge to Center Island and just drive around and look at all the homes. Billy Joel lives there. It's where
Oh.
the very, very rich live, and it's gorgeous. Really, just a beautiful gem. Glen Cove has got a great downtown with live music on a summer night, really good restaurants. I would definitely pay a visit there. And Port Washington is just a classic, sort of one of those classic old school downtowns with Main Street and all the little shops and coffee shops and restaurants and all of that. Off the top of my head, that's where I would send you.
As you might have figured out, I'm sort of a sucker for maps. Always have been. When I was a kid, I used to look at maps for hours on end. Tell me about the village of Muttontown.
Do you like that name?
I really, really do.
Isn't it a great name? I know. I still haven't gotten used to that. There's a place called Muttontown. This is a very wealthy area. It's a village. They've had a lot. You could do a whole podcast on the politics of Muttontown. They've had such dramatic politics and village politics. It's wealthy. It's lovely. It's beautiful. You know, it's the kind of place where people aspire to live.
I'm going to beg your indulgence for a second, because I'm going to do an unsolicited ad for a restaurant in Muttontown called Mara's Southern, which used to be Mara's Homemade. I lived in Louisiana for a year and a half and developed a Cajun food itch that needs to be scratched every now and then. And they do boiled crawfish and great Cajun food. When I first found them, I've been on their email mailing list for about 12 years, because when I first found them, they were in New York City on 6th Street in the late 2000s. There was a stretch of 6 where there were like 14 Indian restaurants and a Cajun place stuck in the middle for no good reason.
Wow.
And I used to go there, and it's possible that on the evening of May 14th, 2011, that I ate the last crawfish that they ever served in their Manhattan location. And it's possible that we may have a photo of that.
Oh, that's great.
A very young or much younger me enjoying literally the last crawfish there. Anyway, I'm on their mailing list, and I heard from them that they are not doing well in terms of people walking into the door and eating.
I'll go. Mara, M-A-R-A?
M-A-R-A. It's now Mara's Southern. They have Southern barbecue and,
all right,
and Cajun food. Tell them some weird guy on a podcast said they may remember who I am. It's been about 4 years. I think in 2018, the Democratic State Convention was on Long Island. I covered it for FiOS 1.
I think that was 18.
I think that's right. And then went across the island to go to Mara's for dinner. Anyway, just thought
By the way, you haven't aged a bit. You haven't aged a bit since 2011.
Thank you so much. That's really that was really the point of putting the photo across. Anyway, my love for Mara's, and let them know that Andrew sent you. All right, back to the business here. What do we know about the demographics of voters? You mentioned a little bit of income. What do we know? Age, generally, education level. Is there any stat that you think we should look to get a better sense of who the voters are in the 3rd district portion of Nassau?
You know, because it is such a diverse district, and there are so many different kinds of people and different kinds of communities, and each community is so proud of itself as its own community, it's really hard to generalize, but that won't stop me from trying. I would think of the typical Northern Nassau resident as, well, you know, higher education, college degree, good job, a lot of commuters, family people. You know, something you have to think about is, what's your stance on Israel? Because there's a lot of Jewish folks who live up there. As in, you know, there's a big Jewish community across Long Island, especially in Nassau County. So you have to be sensitive to that. That might be more of an issue in the general than the primary. You also have to be concerned, you know, these are people who are concerned about their property values. They're very concerned about their schools, about education, and they're concerned about public safety.
What are the big employers, big businesses in the Nassau portion of New York 3?
Actually, the biggest employer on Long Island is healthcare, and it's also the growingest, if I can coin a new word. So a lot of folks in healthcare, but you know, you'll find a lot of folks who commute into the city, or at least did before COVID. You'll find a lot of folks in the financial industry, in the health professions, lawyers, accountants, the professional classes. And then there's, you've got working families and working communities as well. So you've got to make sure that you're talking to everyone. And, there are certain things that resonate with everyone: crime, education, things like just very basic governmental issues, like how are the roads? Is the drinking water clean? What are you going to do about, there's a big issue out in Bethpage with a Grumman plume when Grumman was building for World War II, building all of the machinery and the planes and everything. A lot of the pollutants got into the groundwater. What are you doing about that? There's a lot of concern about that. That's an issue that is of concern to everybody in the district. And it is a district that hugs the shore, and also, of course, goes around the Sound, going up to the Bronx and Westchester as well. So there's a lot of concern about climate change. There's a lot of concern about the quality of the water. Are we keeping it clean? What are we doing? How are the shellfish doing? All of those issues are very important to those communities.
You've touched on the periphery of this question. Are there unique entities inside the Nassau portion of the district that might require outsized federal money or assurance or protection or involvement from a member of Congress? I was thinking in general terms of like a military base, which I don't think there is in the Nassau portion of the third, but anything like that comes to mind.
Yes. After Hurricane Ida, Tom Swazi and I actually did a tour, and some of the other elected officials as well, around the North Shore, where there were mudslides in a place called Manor Haven, where there had never been mudslides before. There was flooding in parts of Great Neck where there had never been flooding before. And we had to get FEMA involved. So, in those kinds of, and I imagine, I hope I'm wrong, that those kinds of events will happen frequently, more and more frequently, as the climate changes, and the federal government will be expected to help. So if I were one of these candidates, I would be very much on the forefront of saying, I will be here for you. I understand the vulnerability of our communities that are by the water, and we have to make sure we're shoring up our infrastructure, we're investing in the drainage, and we're making sure that we can keep these communities safe through these kinds of events.
As we begin to approach the primaries, the only active primary really in the third is on the Democratic side. You've already touched on some of the issues that may pop up. Any other national issues that you think will have particular resonance in the third? You mentioned jobs, you mentioned crime and security, you mentioned climate and the environment. Anything else that you think?
I think voting rights in a primary is a very, very big issue in a Democratic primary. Single payer healthcare will be interesting. And this is sort of like bail reform in a way, because what do you say in a primary about single payer healthcare? And then does that match what you're going to say in the general if you win? Because it's a very different issue in the primary than it is in the general, but it is an issue that should be paid attention to. And who will, go all in and say what they think and just be clear about it, and who will kind of mince around and tiptoe around the issue? That'll be interesting to see. Because there will, as with most primaries, there's a pivot from the primary to the general.
And you mentioned turnout as part of your race last year. Historically, primary turnout, particular because we're approaching the primaries in June. Better turnout generally in a congressional election year. I mean, one of these days, I think we need to have a larger debate about the merits or lack thereof of having important elections on off-year cycles.
Yes, I'm with you there, Andrew.
I mean, the entire time I've covered politics in the area, the year after a presidential, it's the New Jersey governor, New York City mayor, Nassau executive, Westchester executive, and I'm always mystified as to why they schedule them on those particular years. But putting that aside and leaving that for another podcast, you're expecting more turnout, both in the primary and in the general?
I'm sorry to say this, and I feel bad as a former candidate myself. It breaks my heart. People really don't show up for primaries. You really just don't get a lot of people. People don't know the candidates. I'm sure, but and this is no criticism of these candidates, because I know they're all good. They're all working really hard, and they're sincere people. They're good people. But people just aren't paying that close attention. It's hard to penetrate through all of the clutter in the media and in the political discourse, and people are just living their own lives. That's for to get people to really pay attention to a primary in a congressional race, especially when there are a lot of people. It's a challenge. It's difficult. So I would like to be optimistic, and I hope again that I am proven wrong, but I just don't know if this will be a big turnout race. But prove me wrong, voters, please.
I think you're right about that. Although I think Democrats will actually get a boost in attention from voters. As I mentioned earlier, the last week in May, the first week in June, I think the Supreme Court is going to issue some rulings that really bring Democrats back into politics.
Yes. I mean, we're looking at things like, oh, of course, one of the biggest national issues is abortion. And that it really does motivate Democratic voters.
All right,
if there are more restrictions, this will get people going for sure.
I'm pretty sure the Supreme Court's going to serve that up for Democrats on a silver platter.
That will help. That will help turnout. It's sad but true. I mean, it's sad that it takes people being afraid and threatened to come out and vote, but there it is.
So let's move on to some history and some trends in the district. Let's start today and work backwards a little bit. As of the beginning of 2022, I think there's about 100,000 more Democrats registered in Nassau County than Republicans. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that's been trending more and more Democratic, at least the registration numbers, but historically, Republicans have generally had the numerical advantages in Nassau. Is that right, going back the past few decades?
Correct, yes. I was the third county executive out of, since there were county executives.
In 80 years, you were the third Democratic elected in 80 years.
Yes, exactly.
As Nassau County executive. Congratulations on that, by the way.
Well, thank you. It seems, how, this is how I think of it. The Democrats in Nassau County, maybe because they don't have that history of being in power, don't seem to have the same kind of turnout apparatus that the Republicans do. And so while we have a numerical advantage, we do not have the get out mechanism that the Republicans do. The Republicans tend to be much more disciplined voters. Just my election, right? 25% turnout of Democrats versus 40% of Republicans. That tells you something. And I always say, when I was out campaigning, I would say to people, get out and vote. It's up to you who you vote for. Hopefully you'll vote for me because I think I'm the better candidate, but whoever it is, vote for your candidate. Otherwise, you won't have impact. You won't have influence. You won't have an ability to have any influence over policy or tone or any of that stuff. So I feel like I just really need to preach to people, whatever the election, whether it's for your sanitation commissioner or school board or a congressional primary, get out and let your voice be heard. Because everybody likes to complain about the government and say who's terrible and who did this and who did that. But honestly, I don't want to hear your complaints unless you have actually voted.
By the way, I think that historical registration advantage goes a long way to explaining why Nassau elects county executives in off-year elections.
Bingo.
I think it's the historical. I think it's the same thing in Westchester. The historical strength of the Republican parties in both areas put it there. I think the opposite is true in New Jersey and New York City. I think it's the traditionally strong Democratic parties that have put it in off-year elections, because I think off-year elections help establish power blocks.
Yes.
So maybe we don't have to have a whole separate podcast about that. We seem to have.
We did it. We covered it.
We covered that pretty quickly. When you look at the statewide congressional map, the only red districts that are south of Albany right now are on Staten Island and Long Island. Why do you think the Republican Party seems to enjoy more success on Long Island than anywhere else in Southern New York? And it can't possibly just be because they're both island communities. That doesn't make any sense.
That's a good question. I'm putting on my sociological hat now, armchair sociologist. I think because a lot of folks from Long Island have roots in New York City, whether they moved themselves or their parents or grandparents moved, for nice quality of life, good schools, stability, public safety, and all of that. And those are values that they hold dear. And those are values that, I think they're human values, but, perhaps are more comfortable in the Republican Party. I don't know. That's just me thinking off the top of my head.
No, I appreciate that. It's a question that's puzzled me for a long time. I'm curious for whatever voices I can hear on it as possible. I can also remember when Republicans on Long Island were somewhat wary, especially elected Republicans, somewhat wary of Donald Trump as a politician. Peter King spoke about Donald Trump with caution. So did Lee Zeldin, actually, at least before the autumn of 2016. Different version, different take on my last question. Why do you think Trump seems to ignite so much energy on Long Island and so much more than he seems to elsewhere in downstate New York? Is it a class thing? Is it because Long Island is more blue collar? I'm curious.
So interestingly, the former Republican chairman of Nassau County, the one who was there before the guy who's there now, he was one of the very first committee chairman to endorse Trump's candidacy back in his primary. So I thought that was very interesting. I think Trump's appeal to some of the Long Island voters has to do with that you could say he's an elitist because he's a very rich guy from a very rich family, but his persona is against the elite, against the establishment. He's the guy who personifies how some people want to be, just, saying exactly what he thinks, not worrying about hurting people's feelings, being blunt, doing it with a sense of humor. I could see why some of our residents on Long Island would find that appealing.
The next couple of questions, I'm going to ask you to take your best educated guess on it, and I apologize for that, but I'm curious for your answers. Best guess among Nassau Republicans. Where do you think the average Nassau Republican lies on the spectrum between, let's say, Trump and a Romney Republican?
I think you would find plenty from both camps and everywhere in between. I do think in Nassau County, the Republicans tend to be more moderate than more further to the right. I think that's just same with the Democrats. The Democrats tend to be more moderate than super left. So they might not go for the most progressive candidate. But I think you'll find it all in Nassau County. I can tell you that we have every kind of person with every kind of political persuasion, but I think it's a safe bet to say the majority are somewhere in the middle.
And
Andrew, they just want to live their lives. They want the roads to work. They want to feel safe sending their kids to school. They want to get value from the high taxes that they pay. And they just want to live their lives and be happy. And they don't really need anything more than that.
Don't we all want that, Laura?
Don't we all want that? Exactly.
You also answered my next question, which is going to be the average Democrat in Nassau on the spectrum between a Bernie Democrat and a Biden Democrat. So you've answered that. But I do want to ask about another trend that we've seen elsewhere in the district and elsewhere in the region, and that is the trend of Democrats, the rise of progressive movements and progressive candidates and voters and elected officials. We have not seen that, at least anywhere near to the level of success on Long Island as we've seen in the Hudson Valley and in New York City. I'm curious why you think that is.
Well, there are some, after the election of Donald Trump, we did see indivisible groups pop up. We saw people become motivated, become interested. So you do have some of those progressive communities. Sometimes, like the Port Washington Democratic Club is very progressive, for instance. And you'll find some here and there. I have a neighbor who's very progressive. We always have very good conversations. But you're right, it hasn't caught on like it has, say, even in Westchester, and certainly not in New York City. But who knows? That could change. Let's see what happens. This is a very dynamic time that we're in. I just would just ask everyone to just find out who your candidates are, read a little bit about them. If you can go to a debate or a candidates forum, go check them out and make up your own mind. I mean, we could pontificate as much as we want, but at the end of the day, it's up to the people to get out and make their voices heard. And then, you have a responsible government.
Into the final set of questions that I have for you, Laura. some voters in Westchester County began the cycle, and I was one of them, admittedly, concerned about the quality of representation that you might get in a district that's dominated by the Long Island portion of the district and also includes slices of the city. When I interviewed Noam Bramson, the mayor of New Rochelle, his city has been split into multiple districts before. He actually said that was more beneficial because in times of need, there were more members of Congress he could turn to for assistance. Nassau currently, and while you were county executive, was represented by the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, and even a piece of the 5th district, which is Greg Meeks's district, mostly in Queens. Has having more representatives for Nassau been a benefit for Nassau in your estimation? Has it been a detriment? Has it had no impact?
You know, I'm thinking of the main 4. Meeks has been great and very responsive, but you've had Tom, you've had Kathleen, who's also, you could do a podcast on that race because Kathleen Rice is not running again. You had Zeldin and you had King. And I got to tell you, all 5 of them as county executive were incredibly responsive and were really accessible and really wanted to be helpful. So I think because Long Island has 3 million people, it has to be carved up into many districts. It's just because of the population and the number of people that live there. But they were all very responsive, very accessible. You know, I could call Peter King, I could call Kathleen Rice, I could call Tom Swazi anytime, and we would get what we needed if we could. We would at least get the honest answer if we couldn't. So it has served us well, but now there's a lot in flux, right? We've got Garbarino now, who I had a fine relationship with, but Tom's going, Kathleen's going, and Zeldin is going as well.
Garbarino, by the way, he's the Republican who succeeded Peter King in the 2nd district.
Correct. Okay. Yes.
As the former county executive in Nassau, you had a unique perspective on the needs of Nassau County in a way that, you know, a lot of voters might not have known, might not have had those insights. Are there any needs specific to the county that you're focused on as this race advances in the 3rd district?
Yes, infrastructure. Shoring up our infrastructure to withstand climate change is huge. We are an island. We're surrounded by water. So we need to make sure that our drainage is working properly. We need to make sure the bulkheads are in good repair. We need to make sure the water is clean. We get one source of drinking water on Long Island, and that's the aquifer underneath us. We need to make sure that's clean, safe water to drink. The water around us is clean. That's a big issue. Wait, there was another one that I had in my head, but it just went away. It'll come back. Long Island centric issues. I gotta emphasize public safety. That's a huge issue for Long Island. Public safety, that's a big one. And I also would not ignore inflation and the economy, which is not looking good right now. I just saw a report by Larry Summers. Not looking good right now. That's an issue that will, that's an important federal issue that affects people on Long Island and we'll be very concerned about.
We saw education, which is ostensibly a local issue, a very local issue, pop up in larger races. For example, the Virginia governor's race last year. Do you anticipate that being a factor in New York-3 or in Long Island's races?
So which one? What is that again?
It was schools and
education.
Education, particularly parental involvement. In Virginia, it was all CRT.
Yes, I remember that. Yeah, that's always a big issue, and that's it's a local issue. You got your local school boards, and then it's a state issue that oversees all of the public schools, all of the schools. So that is always a big issue. CRT as an issue has certainly popped up. Absolutely. And that's going to be something that people are going to have to talk about.
Do you have any other thoughts or notes or concerns about the 3rd district race? Are there any questions that I should have asked but didn't ask as we've gone through this? As we've gotten to the end of my list. And I'm just curious if there are any cherries that I've left off the top of this sundae.
Let's see. We talked about climate change. The Green New Deal will probably be talked about in this primary, probably, and also the general. I think you got it all, really. I think you're very thorough, Andrew.
Well, Thank you so much. That was absolutely the response I was fishing for. Laura Curran, the former Democratic Nassau County executive, served from 2018 to 2021. Thank you so much for the time, for the analysis, for the focus. Really appreciate you being a part of the podcast, and thank you.
You got it. Take care.
A couple of updates I want to bring you following that conversation with Laura Curran. Ms. Curran singled out the New York State bail reform law as a potential danger for Democrats running in the third. Well, just a few hours after our interview, New York State made significant changes to that law as part of the new state budget deal. And I want to quote from Bloomberg News' reporting. Judges will now have more discretion in deciding bail based on several factors, including an individual's history of gun use, whether they were charged with causing serious harms, and if they have violated a restraining order. Lawmakers also made hate crimes and certain gun offenses bail eligible and will allow judges to set bail for individuals who are accused of certain offenses against another person or property theft. Separately, they will tweak the discovery process by giving judges more discretion over whether or not to dismiss cases, even when prosecutors fail to meet some discovery deadlines. They will also give prosecutors the ability to pursue some criminal cases against minors until they turn 21 and lower the threshold for gun trafficking charges. However, the legislature refused to introduce a new dangerousness standard into bail considerations, a move that advocates said would increase the racial disparities already plaguing the criminal justice system. One more note from Bloomberg's reporting, and this was the big takeaway for me, quote, both the state and New York City saw reductions in jail population with the bail revisions, but critics tied the reform to an uptick in crime despite a lack of evidence. And that lack of evidence is concerning to me, as it should be to anyone focusing on bail reform in general or within the context of the congressional election in NY-3. Because that means that we're making policy decisions based on anecdotal reporting, public sentiment, and public opinion. And frankly, that's worrisome when there are players seeking to game that sentiment and public opinion against the bail reform law, and frankly, against Democrats, especially since Democrats pushed the original law in Albany. These players are powerful. The New York Post seems to just about salivate at any chance to report on problems connected to the bail reform law, even when later reporting has confirmed multiple times that suspects the paper claims were released because of the law weren't. Now, look, the Post was founded by Alexander Hamilton and has always been political, but this to me seems like a clear example of the paper letting its editorial board or its editorial position lead its reporting team. The board, the editorial board, the ownership, it's a Murdoch-owned paper. They want bail reform to fail, and they want its supporters to look bad. And it seems to me like they're sending their reporters out to cover the issue, but only in that context, only if it makes the law look bad. Similarly, police unions and some prosecutors don't like the new law, in part because it shifts the balance of power, also because it hurts their score sheets at the end of the day. We know that New York City police unions now lean heavily Republican politically, and we've all seen reporting about some police units who responded to the new law by saying, we're going to have to cut back the number of arrests that we make because, well, those arrests are just going to be dismissed or thrown out of court. Frankly, those are stupid arguments from law enforcement. How many of you, whatever it is that you do, if you didn't like part of your job and just refused to do it, how many of you would be allowed to continue doing that job even once you said, I'm not going to do this? It's especially rich when their next complaint is that crime is on the rise because of the bail reform laws, especially when their own actions may well be contributing to any rise in crime. It is clear at this point that bail reform is going to be an issue in the race for Congress in NY-3 and in the Democratic primary in particular, as candidates stake out positions on the issue. And frankly, I expect we're going to see some candidates attacking one another on it. That's why I'm considering adding a special episode of the podcast that would focus solely on the bail reform law, do a little fact-checking on the law, its impact, and on the claim that it is making New York less safe, a claim that Bloomberg News again says comes, quote, despite a lack of evidence. Let me know what you think. It's also highly possible that the experiences of Ms. Curran and other Democrats in Nassau last year had as much to do with low voter turnout as they did the bail reform law. I will leave that determination up to you. But for now, my thanks to Laura Curran for participating in the podcast and doing the interview. You can follow her on Twitter at LauraCurran516. For the video version of this podcast, just go to YouTube and search 3 on NY-3. Remember to put the NY in parenthesis. That's because I did just a solid job naming this thing. So you have to add the parentheses around NY for it to come up in the search results. Good call, Andrew. The audio of 3 on NY-3 streams on every major podcast platform. Just search for 3 on NY-3 or search for my name, Andrew Whitman. No matter where you watch or listen, please hit like and subscribe to get the latest episodes delivered to you. And wouldn't mind if you gave the show a positive review. That would make my mother very happy. I know that. It would also help both me and the show. To share your feedback or any questions, comments, complaints, suggestions, or thoughts on doing a special episode on bail reform, email the show. The address is 3onny3@gmail.com. My name is Andrew Whitman. I'm Whitman Andrew on Twitter, and my email is andrewwhitmantv@gmail.com. Reminders, primary day is June 28th. Election day is November 8th. This has been 3 on NY3 with Andrew Whitman. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.